forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry.
Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Do you copy?
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Hostile APC. Hostile APC. Enemy units on the move. Hostile on the road.
Enemy forces on the move. Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Enemy activity. Enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy units on the move. Enemy units. Enemy activity. Enemy activity. Enemy activity. Do enemy activity. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Inbound. Over. Enemy activity. Enemy troops. Enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Enemy tank is inbound. Over. Enemy tank is inbound. Over.
Spotted. Over.
Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Enemy
armor
Do you
spotted.
copy? We got hostile armor. Enemy units on the move. On the ground.
Enemy force car spotted. Hostile force car spotted.
Do you copy? Enemy activity. Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move. Enemy units identified. Over. Enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Inbound. Enemy aircraft. Enemy aircraft. Inbound. Identified.
Online and sent.
Enemy activity. Inbound. Over. Enemy activity. Do you copy?
Enemy car spotted.
Enemy taken. Enemy units on the move. Enemy APC. Do you copy? Hostiles on the ground. Identified. Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move.
Hostile chopper. Over.
Inbound. Enemy activity. We got enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Do you copy?
We've lost control.
Enemy inbound. Do you copy? Hostile split inbound. Over. Enemy troops. Enemy units on the move. Hostile split inbound. Over. Identified. Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy activity. Do you copy? Hostile split inbound. Over.
UAV online and trans.
Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy activity. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy units on the move. Identified. Enemy aircraft. Enemy overhead. Over. We got hostile armor. Enemy aircraft. Enemy activity. Inbound.
Supplies at your position.
Enemy units on the move. Hostile split inbound. Identified. Hostile split inbound. Hostile chopper. Identified. Hostile split
Enemy
inbound.
APC spotted. Enemy lost control of an outpost.
Enemy units on the move.
Enemy
Hostile chopper. Identified. Hostile split inbound. Over. Hostile split inbound. Over. Enemy activity.
forces over.
Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy vehicle. Enemy unit. Enemy unit.
Start fighting or I'll find someone who can.
No can do. Enemy unit. Enemy forces over. Enemy company overhead. Over. Enemy spotted. Enemy APC. Do you copy? Enemy forces, over. Hostile chopper, over. Enemy company overhead, over. Enemy unit overhead. Over. Enemy vehicle. Hostile on the road. Hostile flick inbound. Over. Hostile flick inbound. Over. We got hostile armor. Enemy unit. Hostile chopper identified. We got company overhead. Over. Hostile chopper identified. Enemy helicopter spotted. Hostile flick inbound. Enemy units on the inbound. Do you copy? Enemy activity. Do you copy? Hostile flick inbound. Over. Enemy tank is inbound. Over. Hostile flick inbound. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy units on the move. Enemy aircraft. Inbound. Over.
We've lost control of an outpost.
Identified. Enemy air assets over. Over. All clear. Enemy air assets over. Out. Enemy activity. Enemy unit company over. Enemy helicopter spotted. Hostile chopper over. Enemy unit on the over. Roger that. Negative. No can do. Spotted. Over. Enemy aircraft. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Hostile chopper. Over. Enemy air assets over.
Position cleared and under control.
We got company overhead. Over. Enemy unit activity. Do you copy? Enemy forces spotted. Over. Inbound. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over.
We've lost control of an outpost.
Hostile vehicle spotted. Over. Enemy troops identified. Do you copy?
We've lost control of an outpost.
Enemy forces over. Hostile jet spotted. Over. Hostile flight inbound. Over. Enemy units on the move. Hostile flight inbound. Over. Enemy units on the move. Hostile chopper. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy helicopter spotted. Hostile chopper. Over.
New commander is on duty.
Enemy forces. Over.
Enemy forces. Over. Enemy infantry. Enemy forces spotted.
Move out. Attack here.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy Enemy force, enemy force, enemy units on it. Over. Enemy sniper, enemy APC.
Over. Hostile split inbound. Over.
Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Over.
Enemy car spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
UAV online and transmitting.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy infantry. Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Enemy spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy APC spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy APC spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Enemy infantry. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy APC spotted. Over.
UAV online and transmitting.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy air. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy helicopter. Enemy car spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy forces. Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy air.
Enemy infantry. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy armor. Enemy spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy armor spotted.
Over.
Enemy forces. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy spotted. Enemy spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy armor. Enemy forces. Enemy armor spotted.
UAV transmitting on this mark.
Enemy unit. Enemy activity.
Hostile forces spotted.
Over. Hostile armor sighted. Over. Enemy unit. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy activity. Attack. Enemy out. Enemy unit. Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy units on the move.
New commander is on.
Enemy forces. Over.
Enemy forces.
Enemy unit. Enemy forces. Over. Spotted. Over.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
UAV transmitting.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy armor. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy helicopters. Enemy infantry spotted.
Over.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces
UAV transmitting on
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces
Move
spotted.
out. Attack here.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy
Move out.
Enemy forces.
Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Over.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces.
Over. Enemy unit. Enemy forces. Over. Hostile chopper. Over. Enemy activity. Enemy forces. Enemy armor.
Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Jet spotted. Enemy armor. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
UAV online and transmitting.
Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Over. Enemy infantry.
Enemy units on the move.
Hostile forces spotted. Over.
Move out. Attack here. Enemy armor spotted.
Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy helicopter. Enemy forces spotted.
Move it.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy helicopter. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Spotted.
Forces spotted. Forces over.
Online and transmitting.
Enemy forces. Enemy sniper. Enemy sniper
Enemy
spotted.
units on the move.
Hostile forces spotted. Helicopter spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy forces over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy sniper. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy sniper spotted. Enemy car spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy units on the
Enemy
move.
forces spotted. Sniper spotted.
Enemy units on the move. Move out.
Enemy area.
Hostile
Over.
sniper spotted. Enemy active. Enemy units on the move.
Enemy sniper
Hostile sniper spotted. Over. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Snipers on our perimeter. Enemy activity.
Enemy helicopter. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy helicopter. Enemy helicopter. Enemy helicopter. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy sniper. Enemy sniper. Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Enemy forces spotted. Go.
Over. Running dry. Need ammo.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy air.
Hostile sniper spotted. Over. Enemy APC. Do you copy?
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy
hostile jet spotted. Over.
Enemy helicopter. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy APC spotted.
Over. Hostile jet.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted.
Enemy APC identified.
Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy
unit on the ground.
Enemy spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted.
Over. Forces spotted. Enemy forces over.
On this mark.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy activity. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over.
Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy
units. Enemy forces spotted. Over. Enemy forces over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy air assets.
Enemy forces.
Enemy air assets over.
Enemy infantry.
Enemy
Enemy
air assets. Enemy air assets. Company overhead. Over. Snipers on our perimeter.
Requesting a pickup.
Enemy forces over. Enemy air assets over. Enemy forces over. Hostile forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy APC identified.
UAV transmitting on this mark.
Enemy APC spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Over. We've lost control of an outpost. Enemy armor. Enemy spotted. Enemy infantry spotted.
Here.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostile forces spotted. Forces over.
Enemy sniper spotted.
Enemy forces spotted.
Enemy ATC spotted. Enemy helicopter. All clear. Enemy helicopter. Enemy forces. Enemy infantry.
Enemy forces over. Hostile forces. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Enemy sniper identified.
Enemy forces spotted.
Hostile jet spotted. Over. Hostile infantry spotted. Over.
Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy helicopter. Enemy helicopter. Enemy helicopter.
Hostile chopper, over. Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Enemy helicopter spotted.
Sniper spotted.
Hostile forces spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Hostile chopper, over.
Enemy spotted.
Enemy armor. Enemy armor. Hostile chopper, over. Hostile forces. Enemy units on the move. Enemy activity. Hostile forces. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy forces, over. Hostile chopper. Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move. Enemy forces.
Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces spotted.
Attack here. Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy forces spotted. Enemy
identified. Enemy activity.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy infantry. Enemy
hostile force snipers on over perimeter. Hostile chopper identified.
Enemy forces spotted. Enemy armor spotted. Enemy sniper spotted.
Hostile forces spotted.
Enemy forces over.
Hostile forces spotted. Over.
Enemy infantry spotted.
Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy units on the move. Enemy forces over. Enemy
forces spotted. Infantry spotted. Enemy armor.
Hostile forces spotted. Hostile forces spotted.
Enemy forces over. Enemy infantry spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy sniper spotted.
Hostile forces. Enemy forces. Hostile forces spotted. Over. We got hostile armor.
Enemy forces spotted. Sniper
We got
spotted.
hostile
Enemy
armor.
forces over.
Enemy units on the move.
We've lost control of an outpost.
Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Hostile forces. Enemy forces over. On the move. Hostile forces spotted. Enemy forces over. Hostile forces spotted. Enemy units on the move. Hostile forces spotted. Over.
over.
UAV online.
Enemy sniper spotted. Hostile jet spotted. Hostile jet spotted. Over. Enemy helicopter spotted. Under control. Out. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy forces over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy forces over. Hostile forces spotted. 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 Over. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces spotted. Over. Do you copy? Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Got it. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy enemy spotted. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over.
Transmitting on this mark.
Enemy forces hostile chopper over. Hostile forces spotted. Forces spotted. Hostile forces spotted. Forces spotted. Enemy air assets spotted. Forces over. Hostile forces. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Forces over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy air assets over. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Enemy cars spotted. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy forces over. Enemy tank is inbound. Over. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Hostile forces spotted. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy forces. Enemy car spotted. Hostile forces spotted. Enemy activity. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Hostile infantry. Enemy forces over. Hostile infantry spotted. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy forces hostile over. Infantry spotted. Over. Enemy forces over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy troops identified. Over. Enemy armor spotted. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Enemy troops identified. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy forces. Hostile forces spotted. Enemy spotted. Over. Do you copy? Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Enemy troops identified. Do you copy? Enemy troops identified. Do you copy? Attack force. Hostile forces. Enemy car spotted. All clear. Over. Position under control. Out. Move out. Attack here. Enemy forces over. Enemy forces over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy forces over. Enemy APC identified. Enemy tank is inbound. Over. Enemy aircraft. Company overhead. Enemy hostile jet. Company overhead. Enemy APC. Do you copy? Enemy APC identified. Enemy forces over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy tank is inbound. Over. Hostile forces. Enemy car spotted. Enemy activity. Enemy forces. Hostile forces spotted. Enemy forces over. Enemy APC. Do you copy? Enemy APC. Do you copy? Hostile forces. Enemy forces. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy activity. Enemy forces. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile APC. Enemy APC. Do you copy? Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy forces. Hostile forces. We're taking casualties. Over. Enemy forces. Over. We got company. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Hostile jet spotted. Enemy air assets. Over. Enemy air assets. Over. Enemy air assets. Over. We got company overhead. Company overhead. Over. Thanks. Roger that. Hostile forces spotted. Hostile forces spotted. Over. You got it. Enemy APC spotted. Enemy forces. Enemy forces. Over. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Hostile forces. Enemy forces. Hostile forces. Hostile forces spotted. Over. Enemy APC spotted. On the ground. Hostiles on the ground. Hostile forces. Move out. Attack here. Enemy forces. Over. On the move. Hostile forces spotted. Enemy over. Troops. Enemy troops. forces, over. Enemy air assets, over. Hostile jets. Enemy troops identified. Jets spotted, over. Enemy air assets, over. Enemy air assets, over.
Enemy troop! Enemy units on the move! Enemy units on the move!
Enemy forces, over.
Enemy troop!
Hostile chopper, over. Hostile forces spotted. Enemy over. Hostile forces spotted, over. Enemy hostile chopper, over. Enemy forces, hostile forces spotted, over.
Identify. Enemy units on the move! Enemy units on the move!
Hostile forces spotted, over. Hostile forces, enemy forces, hostile forces, enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted. Enemy helicopter spotted.
Identified.
Hostile forces, enemy forces, over. Enemy forces spotted, over. Hostile forces spotted, over. Enemy forces, over. Hostile forces spotted, over. Enemy ACC identified. Enemy forces, hostile forces spotted, over. Enemy forces,
Copy. Hostiles on the ground. Hostiles on the ground.
hostile forces,
Enemy sniper.
enemy armor spotted, enemy ACC identified. Hostile forces, enemy forces, over.
Enemy units on the move.
Overrun.
Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy units on the move. Enemy units on the move.
Enemy forces, hostile forces spotted, enemy forces, over.
Enemy activity. Enemy activity. Do you copy? Enemy
Hostile
units.
jets, enemy forces, hostile forces spotted, over. Hostile forces spotted, over.
Sniper. Enemy activity.
Hostile forces, enemy helicopter spotted.
Enemy activity. Do you copy? Hostiles on the ground.
Enemy forces,
Enemy
over.
activity. Enemy units on the move.
Hostile jets spotted, air assets, over. Enemy air assets, over. Good deal, thanks. 10-4.
Enemy activity. Do you copy?
Hostile forces spotted, enemy forces, over.